You're not getting these results. You change things like with the etc. There's gonna have to do that for every single day. So there's no usage with them. But I'll get it. So you're going to get it. So obviously, appreciate it now. It's just you need to lower the
you will have to go rise to some sheer. That's apprehended.
Yes.
Okay, let's get started. So we ended last lecture by beginning this tutorial on machine learning accelerators. And I mentioned that this was like basically machine learning for architects. Okay, so this is not something that you'd get in, a biology class or even a class that, studies machine learning in some depth, but it's what's important for us. Okay, when people run machine learning workloads, particularly on GPUs, what are they actually doing? What does it all actually mean? What are the core computational kernels? How does it all map, etc.? So we started off sort of at this overview of like, okay, brain-inspired machine learning, right? Like what is artificial intelligence? What is machine learning? And then what is this sort of subclass of machine learning that is quote unquote brain-inspired? And then we had the slide here that's basically like, do you remember grade 8 biology or something, right? Like everyone's probably seen something like this before, right? The composition of the human brain at, at that sort of basic level that we're able to understand it. You have these neurons, right, that are in your head, like your brain has, 86 billion neurons, give or take, in a human brain. Different species have different numbers of neurons. Humans have a lot. And then they're connected, okay? So it's basically a bunch of neurons, and each of those are connected with these things called synapses. And these synapses are sort of like wires, right? They're sort of material connections between the neurons that can basically send signals. And there's some terminology, some sort of biology-centered terminology about, what a neuron looks like. It's got, dendrites that sort of come in from other neurons, and then it's got this axon that comes out. It sort of sends the output signal from this particular neuron, and then it sort of branches out into, and then becomes sort of the inputs to the other neurons in the system. Okay, and your brain is just this giant interwoven connection of billions and, huge billions of synapses connecting all of these neurons. And the way that we sort of understand this to work is that there are these things called synaptic weights, meaning that when you send signals across these synapses, the signals are stronger or weaker on, how those connections have been fused, okay? And the way that these connections are fused is sort of how you learn, right? Your brain is sort of adjusting these, at a high level to sort of create paths that are stronger or weaker that sort of determine your thought process, your memories, etc. Okay. At a 10,000 foot view, that's essentially how we think the brain works. Okay. We don't really know because it's really hard to like study an active brain. We can do it, but it's not like you don't have the RTL. Okay. So if you really want to like study something in action, you gotta do it on a live human subject. And even studying brains in animals is tricky too. So, this is sort of like us fumbling around and feeling out the different parts of the elephant to try to understand how brains work, okay? But there are a couple of key things here that are relevant to how machines have implemented brain-inspired machine learning. One is this weights, and this other is this notion of like firing signals, okay, across the neurons. So if we broke down our sort of subclasses of machine learning further, so within brain-inspired, there's more than one subclass, but the two that we'll touch on, one briefly and then one in depth, what's called spiking. Okay, who's heard of spiking type neural nets? Okay, so there's been research work on this. What is the basic idea? So a spiking architecture or a spiking brain-inspired spiking neural net incorporates the fact that these neurons sort of integrate and fire. Okay, so which is sort of like there's a sort of parallel between this and an analog circuit, right? So you can create specialized circuitry that will perform analog and fire of the signals in a similar way to the way that we think that the brain operates. And it's all very cool and all very interesting. And IBM actually built a chip that did this. Okay, it's called the True North architecture. Has anyone heard of this? The two people who know what spiking neural nets are. Okay. So, they take this thing out and you were able to, run machine learning type workloads in native hardware where it supported natively this sort of integrated and fire concept. And then you can build algorithms on top of that to try to do machine learning with this spiking neural net architecture. Kind of interesting. They had some cool publications on it. They had the actual part, taped out and working. Yes, question.
Was it good?
No. No, it was not successful. Spiking neural nets are super interesting, but none of the machine learning you interact with on a daily basis uses this. This algorithmically, it hasn't been shown to do better than the alternative, which we'll get to. Yes.
So the issue with spiking architecture is with the software set, right?
Yes and no. I mean, you can build the synapses, right? The analog, the hardware piece of this is very natural, right? That you can sort of, currents and voltages can sort of mimic the sort of currents and voltages that are happening in your brain and disintegrate and fire. And you can create circuitry that does this very efficiently. I don't know that it's the software, it's more the algorithmic side of it. Like we haven't really figured out how to leverage this hardware in a way that learns at the same rate that we're able to configure other types of neural nets. Okay. Yes. Question.
Yeah. So is each spike almost like a delta function, or
sort of? I mean, it basically, it's not a delta function is perfect, right? But this is like, it's basically like building up, and then spikes, and then it comes down. Okay. I don't know if there's a picture of it on here. I had a picture of it somewhere because was there a picture in my thing? No, I got rid of it. But yeah, it sort of looks like this, and then it spikes, right? And then it tails, and then it spikes again. And then the rate at which it fires is sort of what you're programming, right? And then you're sort of sending that signal firing along to connected synapses. I will admit that I don't know a lot about the algorithms in this space, mostly because I haven't really worked on this particular type of accelerator before. And the reasons for that is that, it just hasn't been shown to be successful generally versus its counterpart. But it's kind of, there's open research on it. It's kind of an active thing that people are still pursuing, but it hasn't found the holy grail of this is where it makes the most sense. In theory, it could be much more energy efficient than the alternative, which is neural nets, which is what we'll talk pervasively about in this class, because these are doing like essentially a bunch of math where you could much more efficiently sort of transmit these electrical signals with these spiking networks, and in theory, do the same thing in a much more energy efficient way. So that's sort of the space that people are looking at this. Again, this came out 10 years ago now. It's generally regarded as a failure. Main project didn't actually, I obviously, IBM is not worth $1.36 trillion. If everyone's using spiking neural nets, they might be. Okay, yes.
Is this similar to neuromorphic computing, like the BRIC project?
Yeah, it's similar. So neuromorphic is a bigger space, right? Neuromorphic is sort of, I think, broadly in all brain-inspired computing, right? So it's something so spiking neural nets are sort of one branch of what you could call neuromorphic computing. Okay, that's my definition anyway. Maybe somebody in the neuromorphic computing group has a better definition of what precisely that means, but it's brain-inspired machine learning, and spiking neural nets are, the BRIC project here at Purdue is not also saying we're not going to do normal neural nets, right? That's still sort of brain-inspired in some ways. Okay, other questions on this? So do read this paper. There's a PNAS paper on it, which is like one of these super famous journals in the sort of general science space, because these things cross over, right? It's not just computer engineers and computer science nerds that like this, because whenever you tell the public that you have a machine that looks like a brain, they're super interested and scared because it's like, the machines are coming. But it's sort of, there's these crossovers between biology that makes it kind of interesting to people outside of just electrical engineers. And there's, these publications sort of reflect that. The other subclass inside brain inspired that is not sort of spiking inspired is neural networks, okay? Which is what probably most of you have heard about, and it's what most of the machine learning that's actually working today takes the form of. So how does this work? So instead of modeling the firing of these synapses with the sort of analog build and fire, we're instead going to model how they communicate with essentially mathematics, okay, with weights, and then we're going to connect together a bunch of neurons. Okay, so we're going to have a model for a neuron. So this is sort of like a 10,000-foot view of what we mean. So we've got this sort of cell body. You can think of this as a neuron. Then you can think of synapses, multiple synapses coming into said neuron. Each of these synapses carries some weight. That weight can be learned. That weight can be changed. And then inside the cell body, it will do a summation across those weights and whatever the input. There's two things that are coming in. One is the weight of the synapse, and the other is the data that's traveling along the synapse, which we call activations in this case. You sort of do this summation of all of these weights with all of the data that's flowing through. There's a bias term in here as well. And then you will use that mathematical function to basically figure out what the output is going to be. Okay, so based on this sort of summation, multiplication and summation of all of the synapses and the data that's currently flowing through, what am I going to output to the next cell body that is going to sort of follow along this chain? And the way this is done is generally with this function that's sort of summing up, just basically multiplying the weight by whatever the value of the input is. And then there's this function that it goes into called an activation function, because we don't just literally take the final value. There's some additional massaging we do to that final value to produce what we call the output of the cell. Okay, what are some common activation functions? Does anybody know?
Rectified linear unit.
ReLU or rectified linear unit. What's another one?
GLU.
Sorry?
GLU.
GLU?
Yeah.
What is GLU?
So it's like a very smooth ReLU.
Okay. Leaky ReLU. I mean, there's different variants of ReLU, right? So what does ReLU mean? It means that if the value is less than 0, you just cap it at 0, and then everything else is just linear. And then we'll talk about some of the other activations. What is a classic activation that was around long before ReLU got cool? Sigmoid. Okay. Back when I learned machine learning in 2010, it wasn't, ReLU was not what everyone was sort of focusing on. They were basically in the sort of classical dead machine learning phase, I would say, of the 90s, where nothing really worked. It sort of persisted. They thought that a lot of whether or not these things worked was the sort of subtlety in that activation function. And so there's this thing called a sigmoid, and we'll see what it looks like. It's very smooth, continuous time signal. It's very computationally expensive, or at least relatively computationally expensive to compute the sigmoid of a value versus something like ReLU. And so there's a bunch of different ways you can sort of massage that sort of summed weight to produce the output, and we'll talk about that. But the general idea, the inspiration for how this looks like a brain, is that you've got a bunch of synapses that carry weight, and those weights can be learned. There will be some algorithm to learn those weights to try and train the brain, or train this network to basically do whatever it is that you want. Okay? General questions so far. Who has seen this? Most people in this class, right? Where?
275.
2875, what is that?
Python data science.
Python data science. So they teach you neural nets, or at least the basics of it there. Do they get you to do PyTorch?
No.
Okay, then why do they tell you this? Okay, just because it's cool and it's like, hey, I want to be relevant. Okay, fine. I mean, look, if that's what floats your boat. Okay, so how do we connect these neurons? What is the sort of parlance? So you've probably also seen this, because if you're going to show that other function, you might as well show this. So how does this work? You have an input layer. This is, nominally stuff coming from the input to the whole network, right? So for image recognition, the stuff that comes into the input is images, okay? Two-dimensional data that represents images. And then we have a collection of weights, okay? These are the weights that can be trained. And then that data that's coming on the input layer is multiplied by these weights. You're sort of doing the function inside of what we call the hidden layer. And then there's another bunch of weights potentially that you then do that same sort of function with, but now with different values to produce the output layer. And then the output layer sort of says, whether it's a cat or a dog or whatever. Before deep learning, most neural nets that worked were just one hidden layer. Okay, the sort of big innovation behind deep learning and how things exploded was that there are now multiple hidden layers, tens to hundreds to thousands of hidden layers in neural nets. But in the early days of machine learning, or in the days when I learned this, okay, it was like you had to have only one hidden layer because otherwise it was too hard to train it, too hard to get the weights to converge. There were multiple reasons for this, some algorithmic, some data, but it was like if you tried to have multiple hidden layers, the training algorithms didn't work well. Okay, and then the innovation that caused this thing called deep learning to explode was people having a huge amount of data and then figuring out algorithmically how to train and converge a network that had multiple hidden layers. Okay, so in the early days, it was just like one hidden layer, and you sort of had your weights and you connected them, and a lot of the game in developing early machine learning neural networks was trying to figure out how to represent the input, right? Because now we sort of think of it like just throw the raw data at the network, right? And the multiple layers will massage the input for you. You can just take screenshots of StarCraft 2 and throw it at, a neural net, and it'll figure out what it actually needs. In the early days of machine learning, it was like, well, actually, the project I did in my machine learning class was it was called RoboCode. Has anyone ever heard of RoboCode? It's this little toy environment where you've got a little bunch of robots and they fight each other. Okay, so your robot can move and it can shoot, and you had to decide what were you going to give this single layer network as an input? Am I going to give it the position of my robot, the position of the enemy robot, the position of my turret, my current health, the other robot's current health, all this contextual stuff where you, as the person developing the machine learning model, had to pick out what is the input that makes sense. And then it was random. It was like, okay, well, if I pick his position to, if I picked it too fine-grained, his exact X, Y, it doesn't train very well. But if I just tell him what quadrant I'm in, or if I just do the distance between he and I, it trains better. There was sort of all of this nuance in trying to pick the right inputs to get the thing to train properly. Today, with deep neural networks, you usually don't have to do that. You're usually better off just giving it the raw input that you, the human, sees, like an image of a screen or current positions of everything or whatever, and then just letting the network sort of decide what features matter. So feature selection used to be really important, much less important today with deep learning, okay? But sort of parlance-wise, there's an input, there's hidden layer in a single layer network, and there's multiple hidden layers in deep networks, and then there's an output layer. Questions on this? Again, you've seen this before too, right? At some point. Okay. So deep neural networks are, again, a subclass of neural networks in that there are multiple hidden layers. Okay, because what you really care about in a neural net is the output. Okay, you train this thing and it's going to tell you like cats and dogs. It's going to, decide where to move your robot in this frame. Like these are the sort of final output decisions of a network. And you don't care so much about what's going on in the guts of it. But deep learning is the phenomenon of having multiple hidden layers in the network. So not just one layer of weights that you're training, but many. And the way that this conceptually works is that the multiple layers of the network are doing feature selection for you. So whereas I, as a grad student in 2010, had to go pick out what I wanted from the robot environment to send to the layer that made the final decision, the intermediate layers in a deep neural network, if you train it over enough data, are conceptually figuring out what parts of the input matter. So the way that this is sort of commonly presented is you sort of throw an image at one of these things. The very early layers are trying to find edges, right? Trying to find very basic features. As you get deeper in the network, they're putting together those edges to find bigger components of the image. And then by the end, you're sort of you've sort of put together all of these pieces starting at the sort of, basic edges, and then you can decide whether this is a Volvo or this is a Pontiac or whatever, okay? And if you present it with enough data, you sort of, the idea is that it naturally figures out using weights, if you train it over and over again, how to detect each of these things given a big enough data set. That's the idea, okay? Questions on this? All right. Yeah, go ahead.
How is this different from just a linear regression or parametric model with an equal number of parameters?
I mean, it's sort of, how is it different? The way, okay, so for images, for example, we use something called convolutional neural networks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the way you move through the data, the way you train this thing, the way that the network is constructed, I mean, look, at the end of the day, this is all basically a big filter. Okay, if you're a signal processing person, signal processing people look at deep learning and they say that this is a filter because that's sort of what it is, right? It's essentially some regression model that is learning what the weights are for the regression model, but it's doing it in this, very computationally intensive way. I mean, there are parallels between these things. How is it different? I mean, the algorithm to train it is different, right? The algorithm to perform the regression is different. And you could sort of think of this as like a high dimensionality regression, right? Of trying to regress at these sort of fine granularities over these trillions or billions of weights, what their value should be in this giant dimensional space, if you want to think of it that way. Okay. Other questions? There's also not a lot of fantastic theory on this, okay? The impetus of this field is highly empirical. Basically, even constructing new neural nets is highly empirical. There's no golden rule or no set of things that you would follow. I mean, it's kind of like processor design in some way, right? It's sort of like you sort of measure things and see what matters and then try different things and then iterate. Like the construction of AlexNet, why was it built that way? Well, it was the sort of student iterating over different designs of the network and figuring out what worked. And then there's these sort of rules of thumb people come up with, like, oh, you need pooling layers or you need normalization layers, and that sort of makes it train better. But it's not like there's a Bible of like, this is how you construct the correct neural network. It's very driven by empirical results. And, we haven't got a good theoretical grasp on why some things work and why some things don't. Okay. Other questions on this? All right. Who's seen this before? Something like this. Deep neural. Did they do this in the 200 level class too? They did deep neural networks? You don't think so? You think so? Okay. All right. So terminology, these are neurons. Okay, these are the different layers. These are the synapses. What this boils down to is math. Okay, so you basically are taking the summation over all the weights multiplied by all the activations from the previous layer, and then all the input values. Like you can think of these as just floating point values. That's what most of this is when you're doing the training. Each weight is its own floating point value, each X is its own floating point value, and then it produces its own floating point value to send to the output. Okay, this is literally just math. There's obviously sharing happening here because multiple neurons will share the same weights. You can see in this first layer, which is what we would call fully connected, all of the input activations are connected to all of the neurons in the hidden layer. And in terms of terminology, right? So when we talk about layers, it's really the synapses. It's really the connections, the weights. That's what constitutes a layer. Also called filters. We'll talk about this as we get deeper into the terminology here, but this is where all of the, most of the values that are trained live inside these layers, live inside the weights. The input to your first layer is the input usually always to the network itself. So in the examples of trying to do image recognition, this would be literally the color values of the pixels of the input image. That's what will come into the network. It would get, go through this layer, and then you would basically produce output activations based on what the values were coming in. Those would then be fed to your next layer, where the same process happens again, except on a different bunch of weights. And then you produce your output activations. And then you can interpret those output activations to try to figure out whether this is cat, dog, whatever. Okay, it'll be some numeric value that's output that then you can say, you know, you can map to a particular class of whatever it is you're looking for. And it gets a lot more nuanced than just cat, dog, but that's sort of the classic example of just recognizing images. There's this terminology of fully and sparsely connected. So in this example, I've sort of pruned the layer 2. So the front layer is still fully connected, but the back layer here, L2, is sparsely connected, meaning that there's not full connections between all of the input neurons and all of the output neurons. And again, this topology is dependent on how the network, the person who constructed the network decided it should be constructed. Okay. And in some training algorithms, you will intentionally create sparsity. As weights sort of go to 0, you will drop out some of those weights. Sometimes that actually even helps the training go faster because there's less things to train. This is what's known as feed forward. Okay, when we send it always forward, never backward, you don't have to have connections that way. You can have feedback connections that would look something like this. Different types of neural nets will use different types of connections. And so if there's a synapse that goes from one way back into itself and not forward to the next layer, that's what we call a feedback connection. Okay, so there are many different ways to connect these things. You can dream up any way you would like. The most popular types and the types that we'll study in some, well, we won't study all of these, but the ones that we'll look at least in some detail are here. So fully connected is feed forward, meaning there's no feedback. And it's a multi-layer perceptron, meaning that, you know, it's basically just you've got this sort of single layer that you have full connections on both sides. So that's what we say when we say it's fully connected. So if a layer is fully connected, then that means that you have weights sort of connecting everything. Typically at the end of deep convolutional neural networks, there will be a fully connected layer. That fully connected layer is what then decides whether this is cat, dog, whatever. Okay, it's typically the final layer in networks. Convolutional layers, who's heard of convolutional neural nets? Okay, in that 200 level class? Or just, what's that? They mentioned it once. Okay. So this is their feed forward. So there's no feedback here. If you think about it in the same way as that picture I just showed you, they're sort of sparsely connected because not every weight is touching every neuron. And there's significant weight sharing because the way that the convolutional neural networks work, they sort of slide the filter across each of the images or each of the inputs. Recurrent neural networks have this feedback. They were sort of popular for a time for doing things like, speech recognition, natural language processing. Not so much anymore. Transformers have sort of taken over that space. Long short-term memory, LSTM, includes feedback and some storage, meaning that, each individual neuron actually has some memory of what it's seen before. Okay, which is not true in a feed-forward network. There's no memory, right? If in a feed-forward network, once you train the weights, every time I send new data through, it doesn't matter what the last piece of data I sent through was, it's always going to output the same result. In an LSTM that actually has some storage, if you sent, and this again was originally popular for language models, you're trying to parse sentences or something, if you saw the word the, you want to remember that you saw the word the when the next word was cat, right? So you're trying to contextualize language. It's useful to have some of this storage was the original thinking. Terminology, inference versus training. Okay, so training is what we do to determine the weights. So you start out and you don't know what any of the weights are. They're essentially randomized, okay? There are different ways to train this. Supervised means that the training set has full labels, so you know what everything is. So you can basically use then some learning algorithm to, the way to think about this is that you sort of send images through, you get to the end, you know what the image was, right? You know the image is a Volvo, the thing said it's a dog, you slap it and say, no, it's not a dog, and then you update all of the weights. And then you do it again with another image, and you do this a billion times, and then eventually, once you sort of, perturb the weights for the correct answers and sort of smash down, the weights that are leading you to wrong answers, you'll eventually converge on something that's usually right. Okay, that is the general process, and that's supervised learning. Unsupervised learning means that you haven't even labeled the training set, so you can't perform this sort of, I know that this is a car type training, okay, which is more challenging, usually takes more time, takes different algorithms. Semi-supervised means the data set is partially labeled, so you've got labels for some things, no labels for others. And then reinforcement is when the output assessed by rewards and punishments. So reinforcing whether or not you got the thing right is sort of one particular way that you can train these things. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways to train. There are different algorithms to train, and that entire class is used to determine the weights. And this takes a huge amount of time. Okay, training something like GPT takes months and months of time on huge clusters of GPU resources. Okay, because they have to churn through so much data to sort of create this, to create the baseline weights, as you go. And so what usually happens is the machine learning architect will create the network. Okay, they'll create the training algorithm. They'll tune these things called hyperparameters, and then they'll throw the sort of corpus of data at this thing, and then watch how its accuracy will change over time. And and then they sort of repeat this process, trying to get a network that performs well is an incredibly computationally intense process. And you don't really know when you start the training whether it's going to be good or not, right? So often there's a lot of training that's thrown away because that's not the final result. You go and you perturb your network to try and make it work better. So that's why it's really hard for players outside of multi-billion-dollar companies to train these super giant networks, because it's not just the training at once that's the problem, it's the developing the network that's the problem. You need to do this in an iterative fashion, over and over again, consuming huge amounts of resources to try and figure out the model that's going to work best. Okay. Inference is after the training is done, and this is much cheaper. You don't go backwards through the network. Okay, when you train, you go forwards, you figure out what it said, and then you take that result, and then you basically do an update of all the weights propagating backwards. Inference, you're only going forward. So you've already trained the thing, and you're just trying to figure out what it says. If it's wrong, it's wrong. You're not going to change any of the weights. Okay. So when you're interfacing with ChatGPT, for example, you're performing inference over and over and over again. You're not training the thing; it's already been trained. You're just sending it queries, and it's flowing through all the weights that's inside of it, and it's spitting out all the next words that you want for your particular question. Okay. Questions on training inference, you guys probably know what this is too. Okay. So deep neural networks, we're going to focus on convolutional neural networks here, because these were the networks that sort of began, let's say, the machine learning revolution, is particularly on image processing. And so, a modern deep neural network, and we're going to use a convolutional network as an example, will have 5 200s of 5 2000s of layers. Okay, Alex had how many layers? You guys are doing the assignment right now, right? How many layers were in AlexNet? On the order of what? Give me an order of magnitude. I actually don't know the precise answer, so.
10.
10? Yeah, I think it's somewhere. It's not 100, right? I think it's even less than 10. It's 10 to 20, I think, layers in AlexNet. Okay. In something like ResNet, who's heard of ResNet? Like ResNet just grows, right? There's like ResNet 50, ResNet 100. Like that number that's there is the scaling of the layers that are inside the thing. Okay, and usually if you put more layers, it gets better. Typically, not always, right? Again, it's like you have to empirically test it out. Okay, so a deep neural network, and let's take an image network, for example, will look something like this. You'll put an input image through, and then the very first layer will usually be something called a convolutional layer. So you're going to perform convolution on this image with the filters associated with that convolution layer. The output of that, we're not really forcing the output to be the low-level features, but that's conceptually what's happening, right? That's kind of the beauty of this. We didn't like tell the convolutional layer to find low-level features. That's just sort of what it's doing if you train it enough with, back propagation, stochastic gradient descent. It will pick out these low-level features that it will then feed to the next layer of the network, which has been trained to pick out higher level features, and so on, and so on, and so on. And then finally, once you've sort of gotten the output of the last convolutional layer, or some other stuff that happens in between, but then it will ultimately flow into some fully connected layers, 1 to 3 of them typically, like a low number of fully connected layers, which will then output the classes, meaning like, I am 90% sure this is dog, I am 10% sure this is a cat, whatever. And then you can take that result, and have you heard of top 1 and top 5 from machine learning, right? So it doesn't like, it's sort of, there's like a variable that comes out that says, I'm just confident that this is a dog, right? So you have all these classes, and then you basically get a numeric value for all of those classes to say what I think it is. When we talk about accuracy of neural nets, there's like top 1 and top 5. Top 1 says that was the number 1 result correct? Was that actually labeling it correctly? And top 5 is saying, was the correct result in the top 5 of the outputs from this thing? Okay. Typically, when you're asking questions of machine learning, you only really care about top 1, right? Like you really want to guess, like, maybe it's one of these 5. Like, I guess you can use it to winnow down things, but typically when we think about machine learning, we really care about, the top 1 that comes out of these. But, things like ImageNet, et cetera, I think they do top 1 and top 5, which one is best on each of these. Okay, so this is sort of what they look like at a high level, and there'll be hundreds of these layers typically. Each of these layers has a very computationally intensive convolution phase, which we're going to talk about in some depth here. And then after it's sort of done with that convolution, it will push it through an activation function. The most common activation function in many of these networks is ReLU, okay, which basically does this. It just says if the value is less than 0, make it 0. Otherwise, just make it whatever the value was. And it essentially calls off all the negative results and zeroes them out, creating intentional sparsity, right? So sort of like not letting, if you think of it like I'm sort of smashing down weights that shouldn't matter, if I keep smashing them down as I train, they may be pulling down other things that they're not supposed to, and I should have just not, that weight just really shouldn't have been there. It should have just been a 0, and that's what ReLU does. Okay, so you do this computationally expensive convolution, then you have an activation afterwards. And fully connected layers are, as you expect, they're fully connected, right? So it's just, a connection weights between all of the inputs and outputs. And, they again go through an activation phase to get the final, vector of, is this cat, is this dog? I think it's this percentage, et cetera. In between the convolutional layers, we typically do some other stuff. We don't just take the output of a convolution and shove it into another convolution. There are these things called normalization layers, basically to try to get the weights across the filters to be within some range, okay? Because otherwise you may have weights that are sort of drastically large and drastically small, and then, that spraying of the distribution of the weights can cause training to be slow or not correct at all. So empirically, people have found that normalizing the result after convolution helps. And then there's another layer called pooling, the idea of which is to change the dimensionality of the data. So after you do the convolution and the normalization, you'll have a particular, output size. Maybe the output size that you wanted from this convolution is different from the input size of the next convolution. So you use pooling layers to achieve this. And why do you do this? Well, maybe you just want to take a bunch of, maybe you produced a whole bunch of values, but you only really care about the maximum value in some subcluster or the average value. And so there's specific computational kernels that pool them together to sort of parse the data to present it to the next convolution layer, and you sort of keep going. Okay, questions on this? Okay, who's heard of normalization and pooling layers before? Most folks. Okay. Yeah, people are a lot more sort of into this now than the first time I taught this class. All right, so why do we care about convolution so much? If you look at the runtime, 90% of the execution time, 90% of the energy in these convolutional neural nets is spent here. This is where most of the math is. So, Yes, in the early days of machine learning, especially, people were building a whole bunch of very specific accelerators for specifically the convolution kernels because that's where all the time was, right? You do the Amdahl's law, you focus on the thing that's the most important, and the most important in these sort of deep convolutional networks is the convolution layers themselves, okay? All right, so what is happening here? And we're going to focus particularly on two-dimensional data because it's sort of very natural with images. Who knows this sort of algorithm for two-dimensional convolution? Two of you. Okay, so everybody, or maybe three or four. So everybody's sort of seen the high level, but maybe you haven't thought about the, the actual computation that's happening here. Okay, so let's do a 2D convolution on this screen image. So you're in a convolution layer. Is there a question? No. No. In a convolution layer, you will have weights. They're also called filters. Okay, these are synonyms. They mean the same thing. So this is the stuff that you're going to train. If you've got a 2D convolutional layer, which is very common when you're doing image processing, those weights will have a height and a width, which they call R and S. I don't know why they chose these sort of labels for these things. Like, you're going to see a lot of letters here, okay? And a lot of them don't really make any intuitive sense. I don't know why they just didn't call it like F sub Y and F sub X instead of RS. Like, at least then you sort of know it was a filter, right? Now you sort of have to remember that, okay, every time I see an R, that's the height of the filter. Every time I see an S, that's the width of the filter. I'm sorry, but that's just the way of the world, okay? Everyone sort of decided on this. So the dimensions here, so the filter is going to have a particular set of dimensions, and then the input data, and let's start with the very first layer, which is the most intuitive. The image itself has a set of dimensions, height and width, okay? And we call this a feature map. So F. That in the very first layer, the sort of feature map is the input, which is the image. As you get deeper in these layers, it's just going to be some goop that's output from the previous layer that's not really an image. It's nominally detecting these sort of sub-features, but there's not an intuitive map to it like there is with that very first layer. So what you do is you do an element-wise multiplication of every value in the filter across every value in the input, every value in the image. And then you sum that, and then you create one output activation cell. So we're going to create an output here. And again, the output of the dimensions of the output are potentially different from any of these other dimensions. And these are labeled with E and F. So I basically take this collection of two-dimensional filters, I multiply them by all of the values of the input F map, and then I sum them all together, and then I get one product result that goes out into this output activation. This is what's going to be the output of my layer. Okay. Questions so far? All right. Then I move the filter, and I move it by some parameter. This is called the sliding. It's basically what's the precise term for this? Stride, right? It's the stride. So you slide or stride the window across the image, and this stride is dependent on what your network configuration is. AlexNet has particular strides that it uses for each layer. Every network has some stride. The simplest is one. Right, so you're sort of moving over one at a time, but it turns out that's not always good. Maybe you actually want to be moved 4 at a time or 8 at a time. And again, this is a heuristic that's determined when the machine learning person is developing the network. So as you sort of stride across this thing, you then stride to another output activation, and you sort of do the same thing. Okay. Now, in real data, we don't just have one value for your filters. You can have multiple values that correspond to the same logical R and S in the filter, but across a different channel. What's a concrete example of this on the input layer? RGB. Okay, I have a float for R, I have a float for G, I have a float for B. That's 3 channels. So in that case, you would have 3 different filters because I would have 3 different input maps, right? I would have one input map that is the sort of 2-dimensional red values, one input map that is the 2-dimensional blue, and then the 2-dimensional green, okay? And I need corresponding filters for each of these because I will probably need to learn something different based on what the color is, so I don't want to use the exact same weight value. So as you scale out the number of channels or the number of, you think of it as colors in an image, you have to also scale out the number of filters corresponding to that color. And then what happens now is we do a sort of bigger aggregation. So we do a multiplication of every one of the input channels with every one of the input channels of the filter. And then we sum all of that up, and we still just get one output cell in our output product. Okay. Now, we can have many filters, so maybe you don't just have one filter in your layer, you actually have multiple. And now we have another piece of the alphabet soup coming in, which is M, which is the number of filters that you have associated with one layer. And for every filter, you scale an output fmap, okay? Because you scale a channel of the output fmap. Because remember, whatever you do here is the input to the next layer. So in my input layer, it's easy. I had RGB. After I finish that RGB layer, I may actually want 7 dimensions, right? Who knows, right? That's just what the learning mechanism is trying to do. And so if I wanted 7 layers on my output, or 7 channels on my output, I would need 7 different groups of filters. And that's what M is here. And then what do? Well, we do the exact same thing, except now the data is going into a different output channel. So as you scale the number of filters in a layer, you scale the number of output channels M. Questions so far? Yep.
Wait, so C corresponds to different values within the fmap plan? Or...
So C corresponds to so an fmap has multiple channels, but by definition, again, most intuitive thing is RGB. Okay, it can be whatever. I mean, you can have n-dimensional data; it doesn't matter. And that's what a channel signifies. Basically, that there's multiple levels of data associated with one particular pixel, for example, or one particular data item in some data set. Okay, yeah.
Technically, the number of channels in the filter doesn't have to be equal to the number of channels in the output fmap, right?
No, it is not. In fact, we don't get into multiple channel on the output fmap until we get into multiple discrete filters. Okay, it's always, if you only have one filter, then you're only going to get one output.
But if we go to the next slide.
Yep.
They say that you have capital M filters and capital M output channels.
Correct. So every filter you add adds another output channel. Okay.
I see.
Other questions?
But we don't need to add an extra output channel for every filter, right? We can decide to aggregate.
If you wanted to do that,
Because even in the previous slide, we had multiple.
you're kind of like bastardizing the terminology in some ways, right? So if you add multiple filters, as you scale filters, you are scaling the output fmaps. That is the definition. All of this, if you squint enough, just boils down to like a bunch of like fuse multiply adds, right? So the question here is like, what is the common parlance in how we scale convolutional neural nets? If you scale the number of filters, you scale the number of output fmaps. Okay. Other questions? All right. There's one last thing we're going to scale. What is it? The number, no, let's say we're doing one layer. In one layer, what else can I scale? You guys know the answer.
Number of images per
Number of images, what's that known as?
yeah.
M?
And
N? Yeah, and N is, what's the name for M? N usually.
input.
Input,
The
batch size. I'm gonna batch things, okay? So if I just got one input image, okay, one input, there's a lot of parallelism here. You can see that there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen in parallel, but you could actually get more. You could batch the images. Okay, so I'm going to add, and you'll hear this term batch size often. I'm going to add more than one input fmap. I'm going to do n, and this is my batch size. So this is the sort of, grouping of inputs that I'm going to send to the network as I do one feed forward. Okay, and as I scale n, I get different groups of output F maps. Okay. So, so again, and this is it. Okay, this is the last of the alphabet soup. Okay, for an individual convolutional neural net. You scale filter channels as you scale the input channels on any given input map, F map. If you scale filters, you end up scaling the number of output F maps. And if you scale the number of input F maps, you're going to scale the number of discrete output F maps that you produce. Okay. Make sense? Probably not. But anyway, here's the decoder ring of like what all of these letters mean, because you will see reference to these letters a lot. You know, if you go dig around any kind of library that is even use any library that's sort of constructing neural networks, they will refer to NHWC, where you like they will use these letters to refer to the particular dimensions. And the dimensions they're referring to are the things I just showed you on the previous slide, how we sort of scale up this convolution across different inputs, different channels, and producing different outputs. Okay. I'm not going to, everything here is just a written down version of what I've already said. Okay. Questions on that? Okay. So here's the math to do the tensor computation. It's not really that complicated. I mean, this is really like, you know, probably high school level mathematics. It's just got a bunch of letters because there's many different dimensions that we're scaling things across. Okay, the core idea here is that I is your input F maps. Okay, so that you're sort of indexing into I with N and K. Then you're multiplying it by the filter, that's the W matrix. And as you sort of move through I, okay, so as you move through this outer loop, you're moving the filter. Okay, or no. What are you really moving the filter? It's X. That's UX. Yeah, where's X and Y? Yeah, you're moving I and J. You're moving with I and J. You're moving the filter with I and J. And as you move across X and Y, you are not moving the filter, right? So X and Y are sort of moving across. This is as you move each window step. That's what the U is. Okay, you're multiplying by U here because that's the step size as you sort of move through the input filter. Okay, and then you produce the output, which is O, and the output is going to be, you know, an index of N, M, X, and Y. And then there's this B matrix, which is the biases. And again, this is all just, again, the same sort of decoding that we had on the previous slide. And you can compute what the sort of relative, you know, heights and widths of each of these elements are based on, you know, the sort of pictorial example that I showed you on the previous slide. Okay, so this is how you would express this mathematically, okay, for the actual convolution. The code looks like this. So you can express it also in code. And it's just like this super embarrassingly parallel septuply nested loop, right? So you've basically got, you know, many different dimensions that you're iterating over. And at the core of it, you're performing a multiplication and an add and storing the result in the output matrix. That is sort of the, you know, you're trying to multiply all of those filters values by all of the input image values, activation values, and then you're adding them together with whatever you did on the last iteration. Okay, so you sort of sum this up, and then once you're all done, you have to go do the activation, and the activation function is then taking whatever sort of floating point value or integer value or whatever data type you're using, then it's applying this sort of function to it that is the activation. Okay. So the upper four loops here are basically cycling through each output F map, and then the inner loop is convolving the window across that output F map. You can rearrange these, right? I mean, if there's no dependence between the loops, loop independent loops can, or, you know, if there's no sort of cross dependencies, you can reorder loops at will, right? And so this isn't the order you necessarily have to do them in, but this is the sort of most logical order where the outermost is doing the number of batches, and then you're sort of going deeper with each layer. And again, you decode it based on, knowing what M, N, F, E all equal. Okay. Questions on this? So this is the sort of, and this is in your assignment, right? We've given you this, right? This should be easy to put on a GPU to get it to work, not necessarily easy to get it to go fast. Okay. All right. So what's the activation function? Like I alluded to, there are different types of activation functions. Sigmoid is sort of the classical one. It's kind of smooth and continuous. So you get these sort of exponentials on the sides, and during the middle, it sort of slopes up in a very close to linear way. But computing the sigmoid is actually quite expensive because there's an inverse operation here. Hyperbolic tangent is another example of an activation function you can push this through. It's, it will go, so sigmoid only goes between 0 and 1. Hyperbolic tangent is similar, except it goes between -1 and 1. But again, you've got exponent computation here. You've got inverse computation here. This is stuff that is not good at doing fast, right? It's harder to do these types of computations. ReLU is much easier to do fast because you really don't do anything. You just take the old value, and if it was less than 0, you cap it at 0. Otherwise, you just keep the old value. So you can do this in hardware in a single instruction and snap in a very efficient pipeline. There's something called leaky ReLU, which sort of, gives you a little bit of the negative. So there's just a linear computation on the negative, and then exponential ReLU, which again is more subtle. So you don't really spend any computational energy to evaluate it if it's above 1, but then when it's less than 1, you do have to do this exponent and you scale it. Okay. And again, which one of these do you use? This is the black magic of machine learning or construction. Okay. Typically, ReLU works perfectly fine, and it's cheap and it's fast, so you can train more data with ReLU. So even if the other ones have some subtle advantage over iterations, every iteration is way cheaper with ReLU. So it's the one that usually gets picked, at least in historical networks. Historical meaning, convolutional neural networks, et cetera. Fully connected layers, you can also look at them from the perspective of a convolution layer, where you're sort of taking the whole filter and then just plunking it on top of the entire input FMAP. So a convolutional filter with the sliding window, you have a much smaller filter than the FMAP, and you sort of move it along. If you took that to the extreme and just made the filters as big as the input, that's essentially a fully connected layer. Okay. And so you can sort of look at both of these in a similar way. Fully connected layers boil down to a straight up matrix multiplication. Okay, so you have the heights, you have the dimensions of all of your input data. And what I said about these letters, right? So to think about how a fully connected layer works in terms of channels, heights, widths, and all of these different dimensions that I just threw at you a second ago, you basically have M rows in your filters, and then you have CHW wide rows, and then you multiply that by N FMAP. So this is your batch size, right? So as you sort of are putting new batches in, you're getting new columns of the activations, and then CHW is the height of the thing. And then when you do this multiplication, all of you know how gems work, right? So then you end up with just the M and the N dimension left over, and that's your output. So you can in a very straightforward way, take a fully connected layer and just map it to a matrix multiplication. Okay. Pooling layer, how does this work? So what is the idea behind pooling? So pooling is trying to take a group of values and then condense it into fewer values. And there's different ways that you can do this. Max pooling, min pooling, average pooling. But the general idea is that I take sort of segments of my output layer. So if I have this 4x4, and then I have 2x2 pooling with a stride of 2, that means that I'm going to take every group of 4 and then decide that I only want one value from that group of 4. So in this first one, if I use max pooling, the highest value would just be taken. So I'd end up with 23. If I used average pooling, you'd have to actually compute what the averages among these 4, which would end up being 10. And then the same thing is true for all of these other colored cells. And you can use this pooling mechanism to essentially change the size of the activations as they flow through, to try and resize them to sort of get them to fit in other layers. It has the added benefit it makes the network generally more noise resilient because you're taking many values and throwing away that detail and sort of smoothing it over into just one. And which one you choose, well, again, this is sort of a heuristic that, again, is sort of what machine learning network developers worry about. Pooling also has a super nested loop. So similar, it's a 7-layer, or actually this one is a 6-layer nested loop. The internal guts of this thing, if it's a max pool, is really just finding the maximum value. So you're basically testing every input you're sort of going through each of your individual piles. You're testing every one of those inputs to see if it's greater than your current max. If it is, you set the max. If it's not, then you don't. And then at the end, you sort of write to your output whatever the max value was. If you're doing average pooling, then this inner loop would just be computing the average among all of them and not just trying to take the maximum. So this is far less computationally expensive, as you might imagine, right? Like you had this extra loop inside the convolution and it was doing actual math. For the pooling layers, there's not that extra loop and it doesn't really do the math inside. So that's why, you're starting hopefully to see why 90% of the time is spent in the convolution layers, because those are the ones that are doing the iterative math. There's also these normalization layers, otherwise known as batch normalization. So you basically go through your convolution layer and then you have a normalization in between when you produce the output of the convolution and when you go to your activation. And the idea here is to basically try and take values that are, because if they're just floats, right? And you sort of you have arbitrary input values that could be arbitrarily large or arbitrarily small. And then your weights are sort of arbitrarily large or arbitrarily small. When you get your outputs, the variance in the values of those outputs could be very wide, right? And that's bad actually for learning, it turns out. So you're better off trying to smash all of the outputs down, normalize all of the activations from the convolution to try to get a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So basically trying to keep the data within a very small range. You need more precision in some cases if you don't want to lose data if you're doing this, right? But generally, again, why does this work? Go take a machine learning class, but it does, right? It's better to keep the data closer together than have it spray out if you don't do this normalization before you do the activation. And there's, machine learning papers, this particular one that sort of, demonstrates this. If you want to learn about like latest machine learning, look in NIPS, look in ICML. These are the sort of top conferences in that space. That and just strolling archive and looking for the top cited works. Okay, the normalization layer applies some math. So basically, you're trying to scale and shift the value. There are essentially hyperparameters in here on how much you want to scale and shift the value as you normalize. The math here is not super important. Usually, the batch normalization layers are pretty lightweight in terms of computation. And there's these sort of learning factors, right? This gamma and this beta, this is something that the machine learning developer has set as, the rate at which I want to shift and scale the input. And this is what's known as like hyperparameter tuning, when they go in and they change what Y is, they change what gamma is, and they change what beta is, and then they retrain the network. You can end up with different convergence characteristics based on what these hyperparameters are. Okay. So the thing that we're going to focus on most here, as we sort of understand, how accelerators work on this stuff, are convolutional networks and fully connected networks. We're going to do a little bit of max pooling, and we're going to assume that they're going to all basically use RAM, because that's typically what ends up happening. Questions on this? How many of you were bored to death with this because you sort of knew all of this already? Be honest. Some of you. How many of you learned something new from this tutorial? All right, so some. Okay. I suspect as we get deeper into the, 2020s and 2030s, I'll probably just have to not do any of this because everyone should know most of it. I think. I don't know. Any questions on this? All right. So let's talk about the computation. So fully connected layers are sort of simple because they will just map to matrix multiplication. And you'll find that, I've said this before in this class, but most of what goes on inside machine learning accelerator is trying to accelerate matrix multiplication. Okay. It's not just the fully connected layers. Convolutions also turn into matrix multiplication, and we'll show you how that works here. But the basic idea behind fully connected is that you sort of have a filter that's the whole size of the input, and then you have multiple filters, and that will sort of create, produce outputs in multiple parts of this FMAP conceptually. So that one's not hard. Okay, you can just sort of, if you know what the fully connected layer is, you can very cleanly map that into a matrix operation. What is more challenging is trying to do the convolution. Okay, well, actually, okay, we're still on fully connected. So this boils down to dot products at the end of the day. So if we're doing a two-dimensional dot product, what does that mean? So let's take a toy example. Let's take a 2x2 matrix and then do a two-dimensional dot product. Two-dimensional dot product will basically take all of the elements and then multiply each element by its corresponding peer element in the other 2D structure, and then you end up with one output. Okay, that's what's happening here. Now, if you want to turn this into sort of traditional vector math, we can just flatten them. Okay, so if I flatten my two-dimensional filter, that's what's happening over here. I have taken the 1, 2, 3, 4, and instead of logically having it in different rows, I've put it all together in one vector. That's what we call flattening. And then we've done the same thing with the flattening of the input FMAP. So we had 1, 2, 4, 5, and I took 1, 2, 4, 5, and I splayed them out this way. And if you look at the computation you do, if you do a vector by vector multiplication, right, you're basically taking a dot product, taking every element of the vector, multiplying them together and summing them. That's the same as when I represented it in 2 dimensions. This is useful because this shows you how you build the matrix operation. Okay, this is the sort of key step. You go from this 2-dimensional thing into this linear thing, and then we build up layers of the linear thing to get the matrix multiplication. Questions so far? Okay. So for fully connected layers, you basically will have a matrix vector multiply. So you're going to multiply all the inputs in all the channels by a weight and a sum. And if you're not doing any batching, then the width of this thing is just going to be 1. Okay, so batch size 1 will create a matrix by vector multiplication that will result in an output vector. Okay, which has less parallelism than matrix by matrix, obviously, because there's less. You basically have no columns. And so how does that work, right? So you basically take one row of the filter. This is logically one filter. If you multiply it by the entire input FMAP, and then you'll move to the next row of the filter, and then get the next output in the corresponding output vector, and then you just do this. And if you've got a batch size of 1, you basically get an output vector. And if this is the final layer, right, of your network, then each of these elements in the output FMAP is basically telling you what % we think this image is. Like cell 0 is Volvo's, cell 1 is whatever, Pontiac's, and then each of these is producing some floating point value that says, how much we think it is this, how much the network thinks it is this particular thing. Now, if I scale it up to do more than one input at once, so I have a batch size, and that batch size is n, then I end up scaling out the number of columns on the input FMAPs. That's just giving me more input data. And for every column I add, I get another row of the output FMAP. Okay, and that's it. And that's how that sort of fully connected with batching flattens into a full matrix multiplication. If you don't have batching, then the fully connected is just matrix vector. Why wouldn't I want batching? Batching seems good. Why wouldn't I want to do batching? Latency. Latency how what?
For example, if your application wants the result as soon as possible and you are not able to load the input that fast to process the whole input.
Okay, so which operation so where's this more important, in inference or in training? In inference, right? In inference, latency is king. When I type into ChatGPT, I don't want to wait 4 days for the result to come back. I want it to come back now. what does batching do? Well, it takes the thing I want to do and groups it together with what you want to do to make the hardware efficient. But then there's queuing delays. Now you're sort of limited by the sort of, you have to wait and group things into a batch. And then it's also more expensive to do the batch than it was just to do this one single thing. So batching is generally good for compute efficiency because you turn this matrix vector into matrix, but it's bad for latency. So when they're doing inference, they still do batching even at scale because they need to get the efficiencies they want. But it's much more limited than in training where the batching tends to be bigger. In training, the side effect of too much batching actually screws up your learning. Right? It actually affects the convergence of the algorithm if you batch too widely versus batching smaller. So then there's this trade-off of like having your training take forever with small batches. And you do want some batch size for the training, so it's not even like a linear function of like just more batching is better for convergence, et cetera. So batching from a sort of architect's perspective, we just want people to batch as much as possible because that gives us more work that we can then schedule and make the hardware super efficient. But the constraints on batching are twofold. One, in that it occurs latency on inference, which is bad. And it also affects the training convergence when you're trying to train networks. So you don't necessarily want to have huge batch sizes. Yeah.
Also, you need to hold all the batches in RAM, right? So you might run out of.
Yeah, the bigger, you can run out of memory capacity. Your computation gets bigger, right? So you need more memory capacity, you need more compute for it to finish. I like to think of it from the perspective of just having enough work for the super parallel hardware, but yes, you need to scale memory capacity in kind, et cetera. Any other questions here? All right. And then how does this work? Well, it's sort of obvious, right? So you take one filter and then you multiply it by one of the vectors of the inputs. And then as you move across inputs, you're getting new columns that represent each of the columns for the batched outputs. So if this is a batch process that's doing, image recognition, then the answer for my request on was my image a dog or a cat is the first column of the output fmap. The response for your request, was this a dog or a cat is the second column on the output fmap, and then you just sort of go through each of the batches to get each of the different response vectors for each of the n inputs. And then you move to the next filter because, that's the next row of the filter matrix to basically get the next conceptual value, right? So here, the top column is deciding dogs. You'll get a % dogs for everyone. Then you go to the next column and you'll decide % cats for everyone and so on. Okay. Questions? Tiled matrix multiplication. You guys know this, right? This is basically GPU 101. You don't have to do the full matrix operation. You tile it to fit it in cache or in Scratchpad or in the buffer associated with your own special machine learning accelerator. We can take matrix multiplication and tile it, and you have to tile it in a modern architecture to get good performance. This set of slides is doing nothing more than just showing you how matrix tiling works, which you've already done in this class. The implementations for this in practice, usually you don't roll your own matrix multiplication because it is such a fundamental computational kernel. We get you to do it in classes and it's kind of instructive, but if you actually want to squeeze maximum performance out of a gem or a matrix multiplication, you usually have to use a library where there has been millions of dollars in development effort put into trying to optimize the code for the specific matrix size that you care about. So on the CPU, there's BLAST, there's Intel MKL. These are sort of optimized libraries that do linear algebra, of which matrix multiplication is one of them. On GPUs, there's this thing called cuBLAS, which is essentially CUDA-BLAS, okay? This is a closed source package from NVIDIA that has the highest tuned kernels that you can possibly get for matrix multiplication inside of it. So if you're trying to see, hey, is my matrix multiplication as good as it can possibly be on the GPU, compare it against the cuBLAS implementation, and you probably won't be close. Depending on the matrix size, there's only so much you can do, but that's sort of where the most optimized libraries live. cuDNN uses cuBLAS. cuDNN is sort of the wrapper on top of it that you give it a network and then it breaks it down into the BLAS operations. There's also an open source version of optimized matrix multiplication for GPUs on NVIDIA processors called Cutlass. So the bad thing about these packages, if they've got C in front of them, they're closed source because NVIDIA doesn't open source it because, I don't know, they don't want anyone else getting the advantage and they want to control the whole stack. So fine. So there is another package that they produce called Cutlass, which has like 95, 96% of the performance of cuBLAS. So it's very close. The last mile or so is inside the cuBLAS library. But if you want a really good open source matrix multiplication package, you should use Cutlass. And it'll show you how to use, tensor cores and all this stuff, because you need to use that stuff if you want to get optimal performance on these things. And these libraries are smart enough to figure out the shape of the matrix and actually pick different algorithms to do the matrix multiplication, to do the tiling in the way that is the most optimal on this particular GPU, et cetera. Right, and so they map to tensor cores, and we'll talk more about that later. Any questions on this? Yep.
If you're at NVIDIA writing the libraries, how do you do that? Like cuBLAS and CUDNF.
What do you mean, how do you do it? In the same way you write any library, right?
What do you have to think about when you're trying to optimize a jam?
You're optimize flops. You're trying to capture as much locality as possible, such that every cycle, the tensor cores are doing something useful. That is the game. Usually that boils down to capturing as much locality as possible, to basically sharing the storage space that's on chip between the register file, the shared memory. Like there's aggressive register allocation that's done. They're hand tuning the assembly. They're not relying on the compiler to do these kinds of things. The game is keep the sort of matrix hardware busy as often as possible. That's it. And how do you do that? Well, good old fashioned optimization, right? I mean, they have all kinds of tools and visibility that you don't have. They actually know what the machine instructions do, right? And how many cycles they take, and have assemblers that can sort of assemble them. And, so they're able to sort of see the full picture, and they know the whole hardware stack. So it's very difficult to compete with that when you don't have visibility. It's like trying to compete with realtors, right? Like realtors, they have this informational advantage, right? They know more about how houses have sold, right, in the last 10 years, and they know sort of what people are paying. Zillow has kind of broken that model, but like that's how realtors are able to make their money, because they have more information than you. That's the same thing about NVIDIA, right? They basically know how everything works, and they're keeping that information from you so they can usually do better. My apologies to anyone whose parents are realtors, but that's sort of how it works. Maybe it's a bad analogy, but anything else? All right, we'll meet on Thursday. We'll finish off the slide set on Thursday. Okay. See you then.